As a historian who has spent decades immersed in the turbulent chronicles of Tudor England, I can say with certainty that the 24th of January 1536 stands as one of the most pivotal and haunting days in Henry VIII reign. On that frigid winter afternoon at Greenwich Palace, amidst the echoes of hoofbeats and the glint of steel-tipped lances, a king's destiny veered violently from glory to grotesque decay. Henry VIII was 44 years old at the time, still considered by many a formidable figure, broad-shouldered, trained in the arts of war, and possessing the lingering aura of a Renaissance prince who once charmed Europe with his vigor and intelligence. Yet the courtly tournament that day, meant to display royal might and chivalric splendor, became a stage for disaster. In the tilt yard, Henry charged with his lance lowered, the ground shuddering beneath the colossal weight of horse and rider. But fate, ever fickle in the chronicles of kings, intervened. His opponent's weapon struck with such force that both man and steed were hurled into the frozen earth. What the common people whispered later was that the fall resembled not merely an accident, but a divine reckoning. For nearly 2 hours, the ruler of England lay motionless, his armor dented, his breath still, his heart feared stilled. Those 2 hours were an eternity for the court, a realm without a king, a Queen Anne Boleyn pregnant and frantic with terror, and advisors scrambling in hushed corridors, whispering of succession, rebellion, and God's wrath. The injuries Henry sustained were more than broken bones and bruised pride. Beneath the steel plate that caged his body, an old wound in his leg, first inflicted during a similar joust years prior, was violently reopened. Worse still, the force of the impact rattled his skull, leaving what modern medicine now interprets as a severe frontal lobe trauma. At the time, no physician could have foreseen the consequences, yet from this moment forward, the king who rose from that icy field was not the same man who had ridden out with laughter on his lips. This is where history often simplifies. He suffered a bad fall, but the deeper truth is far more complex. The Tudors believed in the humors, in the balance of bodily fluids, in the notion that a wound was a gateway for corruption of the flesh and, by extension, of the spirit. The reopened ulcer on his leg became a chronic, festering sore that would poison his body for the next 11 years. The injury to his head, though less visible, poisoned his judgment. Courtiers later described a transformation almost overnight. Where once sat a monarch of calculated charm, there now stood a man quick to anger, prone to suspicion, and possessed of a dark volatility that neither council nor clergy could temper. Consider the historical context. In early 1536, England was teetering between old faith and new. The break with Rome was still fresh, the pilgrimage of grace brewing in the north, and his marriage to Anne Boleyn already under the shadow of political intrigue. The accident acted as a catalyst, intensifying his paranoia and magnifying his fear of betrayal. It is no coincidence that in the same year, Anne Boleyn would fall from favor and lose her head. When one examines the letters of the imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapais, or the dispatches preserved in the Spanish archives, the pattern emerges. Henry's moods became erratic, his decisions more ruthless, his court a theater of whisper alliances and sudden executions. From a medical historian's perspective, the frontal lobe damage may explain this abrupt change. Modern studies of traumatic brain injury reveal symptoms eerily akin to those described by Tudor chroniclers: impulsivity, violent temper, swings between melancholy and euphoria. The king began to suffer bouts of dizziness, splitting headaches, and a sense of divine persecution. Some records even hint at hallucinations, though cloaked in the language of the 16th century. Visions sent by God or phantoms that disturbed his rest. Imagine the scene in those hours after the fall, torches flaring in the January gloom, physicians applying poultices of wine and vinegar, priests murmuring prayers over an unconscious sovereignty, and courtiers weighing whether to proclaim his death. For 2 hours England held its breath, balanced between dynastic crisis and the hope of revival. And when Henry stirred at last, his breath ragged, his temper raw, the courtiers cheered, but quietly some exchanged looks of dread. They had glimpsed what the kingdom might become without him, and they sensed, perhaps before he himself did, that the man who awoke was changed. Thus began the slow, inexorable descent of a king who had once been the embodiment of Tudor majesty. The fall of 1536 was not a mere sporting mishap. It was the turning of a key, the opening of a door through which crept disease, madness, and a reign ever more stained with blood. If the jousting accident of 1536 was the spark, the years that followed were the slow, smoldering fire consuming Henry VIII from within. In the aftermath of his fall, what began as a single reopened wound on his leg became the throne's most persistent in shadow. As a historian, when I pore over the medical accounts of that decade, I see not just a sore but a symbol. The very body of the monarch, once a reflection of divine favor, was turning traitor. The ulcer that emerged on Henry's lower leg was, by contemporary standards, a nightmare of Tudor medicine. Physicians of the time believed in drawing out the bad humors, lancing and cauterizing wounds with heated irons, or applying poultices of honey, resin, and rose oil. None of it worked. The sore festered, swelling with pus and dead tissue. And each lancing left behind deeper cavities that refused to heal. Chroniclers wrote of an ill vapor that clung to the royal chambers, a stench so strong that courtiers kept sprigs of lavender pressed to their noses during audiences. By the late 1530s, the king's condition had become a state secret and an open secret simultaneously, concealed from foreign ambassadors in official reports, yet whispered about across the courts of Europe. Letters from the French envoy Marillac mentions that the English king was troubled by a malady of the legs, grievous and most odorous. The imperial ambassador Chapais hinted that Henry could no longer mount his horse unaided, and that his mood soured when the wound drained heavily. Here, modern pathology sheds chilling light. The recurring infections likely led to osteomyelitis, a deep-seated bone infection, which, untreated, would have poisoned his blood repeatedly. Each fever that gripped him, each swelling that burst, was a step further into systemic decline. Inflammation of the liver, strain upon the heart, and a creeping fatigue that gnawed at his once ferocious presence. But beyond the medical facts, one must consider the symbolism of such a wound in Tudor cosmology. The king's body was not merely his own, it was the political body. To see it suppurating was to see the realm threatened by decay. Superstition flourished. Some whisper that it was a punishment from God for breaking with Rome, others that Anne Boleyn's restless ghost had cursed him. Physicians, wary of the king's temper, dared not speak of amputation, although some scholars believe that by 1541 it might have saved his life. The suffering was not constant agony, but rather a grotesque cycle. There were periods when the leg appeared to improve, only to rupture again with renewed ferocity. Servants were told to collect the oozing discharge in small brass basins lined with cloth. Perfumes of ambergris and musk from the Levant were burned to mask the odor, but nothing could completely conceal it. This was no ordinary royal inconvenience. It dictated the very rhythm of court life. Journeys were postponed. Hunting parties cancelled, and ambassadors kept waiting while surgeons drained the royal limb. And with each flare of infection came a darker side of the man. The pain carved fissures into his patience. Witnesses describe him lashing out over minor slights, dismissing long-trusted advisors, and demanding ever more ruthless enforcement of his will. It is in these years that his signature policy of executing perceived traitors and heretics accelerated. Was this the work of a tyrant drunk on power, or a man haunted by the knowledge that his own body was rotting before his eyes? History rarely offers clear answers, but the timing is telling. What fascinates me as one who has studied the relics of his reign is the elaborate theater that grew around the wound. Portraits from this period depict Henry in full regalia, legs hidden beneath voluminous robes, his stance wide but static. The court painters, Holbein and his successors, were brought to omit the cane that increasingly supported his bulk. Visitors were received in heavily perfumed chambers lit by candlelight, where the play of shadows disguised the pallor of his skin and the swelling of his frame. Behind the curtains, however, servants scrubbed floors with vinegar and wine to cleanse the seepage that had leaked overnight. By 1540, the ulcer had become less a medical condition and more a grim herald of things to come. It was no longer just a leg wound, it was a prophecy etched in flesh. Those who dare speak of it too frankly, too publicly, often find themselves exiled from court or worse, facing charges of treasonous slander. The king himself, once a proud horseman and athlete, increasingly sedentary, his armor gathered dust while mechanical devices were installed to hoist him to his throne. Thus, the rot was not merely physical. It seeped into policy, poisoned relationships, and warped the very machinery of Tudor governance. The man who had once danced through the halls of Hampton Court was now a monarch at war with his own body, fighting not the French or the Scots, but a relentless, stinking ulcer that would become both his torment and his legacy. By the dawn of the 1540s, the transformation of Henry VIII was no longer whispered. It was visible, tangible, and inescapable. The once magnificent monarch, whose youth had embodied the Renaissance ideal, athletic, scholarly, and charismatic, had become a shadow both immense and tragic. His body swelled, his step faltered, and his temper, already sharpened by pain, turned erratic. Capable of swinging from generous benevolence to murderous rage within a single day. The chronic wound in his leg, lingering since that fateful joust, was only the most visible symptom. Beneath his silks and brocades, the king was waging a war on many fronts, against the creeping infection that poisoned his blood, against the insomnia that robbed his nights of rest, and against the phantoms of conscience that haunted his waking hours. Reports from the royal household describe rooms shuttered to daylight, candles burning at all hours, and attendants dismissed at the slightest provocation. The Tudor court, once a theater of tournaments and masks, had become a labyrinth of perfumed corridors concealing a man both feared and pitied. What makes this period especially poignant for a historian is how carefully Henry tried to maintain the facade of majesty. Court artists continued to depict him as an immovable colossus, broad of chest, legs firmly planted, gaze fixed with imperious command. Yet these portraits were illusions as deliberate as any stage play. Behind the scenes, carpenters reinforced the flooring of his chambers to bear his increasing weight, and mechanical pulleys were installed to raise him onto his horse or even to the throne itself. The proud horseman of his youth could no longer mount unaided. The hunter who once pursued stags across Windsor's parks now relies upon a wheeled chair to traverse his own halls. The physical collapse mirrors a deeper, more insidious decline of mind. Those who served close to him began to note fits of weeping, sudden bouts of uncontrollable fury, and a suspiciousness that bordered on the pathology. Where once he had appreciated counsel, he now demanded obedience. The fall of Thomas Cromwell in 1540. So abrupt and brutal, bore the mark of this paranoia. The very minister who had engineered his marriages and his reformation policies was cast aside, executed on charges as shifting as the king's moods. Contemporaries struggled to reconcile the man before them with the image they had once acknowledged. Some attribute his volatility to the torments of the leg. Others, with more daring, speak in private of an unbalanced mind by a blow to the head and fumes that rise from the corrupted limb. Modern scholars lend credence to these whispers. Traumatic brain injury compounded by chronic sepsis would have amplified mood disorders, amplified impulse control, and fed the mercurial swings that now govern the realm. The consequences were not confined to the private chamber. Policy itself began to bear the stamp of a man oscillating between confidence and grandiose assertion. Religious persecution intensified, yet without consistent direction. One year Protestants were burned, the next Catholics hanged. Nobles navigated this perilous tide with feigned loyalty, aware that a single word could see their estates confiscated and their necks stretched on Tower Hill. Even his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, learned to tread slightly, their fortunes rising and falling with each oscillation of the royal temper. But perhaps the most haunting element of this period was Henry's relationship with memory. In the twilight hours, he was said to call for musicians to play the songs of his youth, to gaze upon portraits of wives long dead or discarded, and to mutter prayers for a son yet unborn. Ghosts seemed to inhabit his presence: Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, all names that echoed in his private oratories. Servants recounted nights when he would demand their company in the small hours, speaking of divine judgment, of betrayal, of the treachery of friends who smile and wait. In these years, his size grew to legendary proportions. Contemporary accounts speak of a man weighing over 350 pounds. His girth is so great that tailors had to invent new methods to drape his robes. His armor from youth became an exhibit, a relic of a lost age when England's monarch was as swift in the saddle as he was cunning in council. Now, each movement was a negotiation between pain and pride, each public appearance a calculated risk of humiliation. To study Henry in this decade is to witness a kingdom adapting to its sovereign's frailty. Courtiers developed a silent code to gauge his moods, colors of ribbons, subtle signals in the council chambers. The shifting placement of guards. When the king smiled, feasts were held and gifts bestowed. When his eyes darkened, doors shut quickly, and messengers were dispatched in the night with orders sealed in crimson wax. Thus the collapse of Henry VIII was not a sudden fall but a slow sinking, a body rotting, a mind unraveling, and a court learning to orbit a dying sun. The monarch who once bestrode Europe like a titan was becoming a captive of his own flesh, and in that captivity the kingdom itself was reshaped, afraid, watchful, waiting for the inevitable but never knowing how violent the next turn would be. By the winter of 1547, the king who once disenchanted Europe was scarcely a man at all. To write of Henry VIII in these last weeks is to trace the outline of a monarch reduced to a shivering mass of flesh and fumes, presiding over a court that had learned to whisper, to tiptoe, and to pray that his breath might either steady or finally cease. The chronicles that survive, fragmentary, often coded in the language of loyalty, hint at a scene that was both tragic and grotesque. The ulcers on his legs, by now cavernous and putrid, had multiplied their assaults. Surgeons drained them daily, yet the foul effusion returned with vengeance, seeing through bandages, staining his bed linens with dark streaks of infection. Contemporary accounts speak of a stench that lingered in the corridors of Whitehall Palace, a miasma of decay that no cedar, musk, or rose oil could fully mask. It was said that courtiers near the royal chambers holding pomanders, small orbs filled with aromatic herbs, to shield themselves from the odor of their sovereign. But the true horror lies not only in the smell but in the systemic collapse it foretold. His liver, long strained by rich feasts and compounded by infection, was failing. His kidneys, distended and inflamed, left him swollen with retained fluids. The belly of the king grew taut, his limbs puffy. His face a waxen mask upon which sweat beaded in unnatural sheen. What had once been the powerful frame of a Renaissance warrior now bore the marks of a man drowning in his own body. Psychologically, these last weeks were a theater of contradictions. Henry was by turns lucid and lost, tender and tyrannical. One night he will demand his musicians play the courtly dances of his youth. The next he will erupt in rage at imagined conspiracies. Ambassadors recorded that his moods could change within the span of a single audience, from tears over his lost wives to sudden orders of imprisonment for those who lingered too long upon their knees. It is here in January 1547 that we see the final flowering of Tudor fear politics. The king's counselors, aware of his impending death, maneuvered with exquisite caution. Who would control the regency for his young son, Prince Edward? Who will rise and who will fall when the mighty hand that signed warrants and pardons fell still? Behind the heavy curtains of his chamber, Edward Seymour, John Dudley, and others conspired, their plans stitched together while the royal body rotted a few feet away. The medical interventions of the day were both pitiful and brutal. Cupping, bleeding, and the application of hot poultices were employed with no lasting relief. Surgeons pricked his skin to release the gases that distended his abdomen, and enemas of wine or broth were administered in desperate cycles. Some nights he lapsed into a half-conscious delirium, muttering prayers, seeing visions, his mother's hands, one account claims, and the pale face of the queen he loved and lost. Perhaps Jane Seymour, the only wife to give him a living son. As a historian, I find this period especially compelling for its silence. No one dared record the full spectacle in open terms. The official dispatches speak of a king troubled by infirmity, yet steadfast in spirit. The reality, pieced together from private letters and later memoirs, was of a man so swollen that mechanical devices were needed to raise him from bed. so fevered that his sheets had to be changed hourly, and so racked by pain that morphia-laden draughts then distilled from poppies became a nightly necessity. On the night of January 27th, a massive stroke, or what contemporaries termed an apoplexy, robbed him of speech on one side. Courtiers pressed for last words, last confessions, but none were clear. By the small hours of January 28th, the king who had ruled for nearly 4 decades lay breathing in shallow gasps, his chest rattling, his eyes open yet unseeing. A few faithful servants, forbidden to announce the truth until the council was ready, dabbed at the foul seepage that escaped his wounds even in death's approach. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, Henry VIII's heart ceased. There was no triumphant farewell, no solemn blessing of his heirs. The official record will later claim he passed in quiet repose, commending his soul to God. Yet those who were present knew otherwise. The end was convulsive, fevered, marked by a final exhalation that carried the sour tang of putrefaction into the stillness of the royal chamber. Thus ended not only a man but an era. The architect of England's break from Rome, the terror of trainers, the suitor who bent queens to his will, he left behind a realm exhausted. A son too young to rule, and a memory wrapped in perfumes that could not hide the stench of mortality. In that dark January, the crown passed from a body that had become its own prison, and the shadow of his last days lingered long after the torches at Whitehall were extinguished. When the last breath left Henry VIII's swollen body in the early hours of January 28, 1547, a peculiar stillness settled over Whitehall Palace. Outside, London lay frozen under a damp winter fog, but within the royal chambers, a far more oppressive chill gripped the courtiers, silence born of fear. The king was dead, yet no one dared say it aloud. For 3 days, England remains officially under the rule of a corpse. The decision to conceal his death was not merely formality. Henry's body, grossly bloated by years of infection and gluttony, was a volatile relic of his reign. Gases built within his abdomen, swelling the skin until it strained against the funeral wrappings. The surgeons summoned to prepare the body faced a macabre challenge, to preserve or at least disguise the corruption that had already begun. They employed the most drastic measures known to Tudor embalmers, opening the abdomen, packing it with salt, spices, and pitch, wrapping it in waxed cloth, sealing it within a massive lead-lined coffin. Yet even lead could not entirely contain what death had unleashed. Traveling to Windsor Castle for burial, the royal cortege moved with unseemly haste, its progress slowed only by the sheer weight of the coffin, nearly half a ton with its reinforcements. At night, the body was placed in chapels or abbeys along the route. One of these, Syon Abbey, would become infamous for the grim legend that followed, that the coffin burst in the cold, releasing putrid fluid that seeped into the chapel floor, and that dogs, drawn by the smell, were found licking the remains at dawn. Whether this account, whispered by foreign ambassadors, was literal truth or politically charged allegory, it reflected a broader sentiment. Henry, the once golden prince, had become a feast for scavengers. Thiers' council, who managed these final days, were men of calculation. Edward Seymour, soon to be Lord Protector for the boy King Edward VI, issued strict orders: no public lying in state, no open coffin, and absolute silence from witnesses. Those who spoke of the stench, the swelling, or the grotesque leakage risked the same fate so many courtiers had suffered under Henry's wrath, though now it was a posthumous wrath, wielded by his afraid heirs. What makes this episode remarkable as a historian is how efficiently the official record erased the reality. The proclamations printed for Londoners described a king who died completely, having commended his realm to God. Chronicles commissioned under Edward VI and later Elizabeth I preserve this fiction. Only in scattered personal letters, in foreign diplomat reports sent to Paris and the Empire, do we glimpse the truer, more unsettling image: a corpse that hissed and bulged, a funeral procession that reeked of decay, a monarchy forced to hide its most powerful symbol because the body itself had become an embarrassment. There is a haunting irony here. Henry VIII had spent decades projecting an image of virility and divine favor, commissioning portraits that showed his towering frame, his muscular calves, his resolute gaze. In death, that image imploded. The very flesh he had sought to immortalize betrayed him, revealing the consequences of his appetites, his wounds, and his long, feasting illnesses. Even the famous Whitehall portrait, which today defines our vision of him, conceals a secret discovered only centuries later. Beneath the paint, conservators found an earlier depiction of Henry clutching a skull-topped staff, a reminder of death he once carried, later erased to preserve royal dignity. The secret that shrouded Henry's burial had long-term consequences. Rumors of poisoning, of divine judgment, of a king cursed by the ghosts of his wives, flourished in the absence of transparent ritual. Catholic commentators in Europe whispered that his body had been rejected by the earth itself. Protestant loyalists countered that his suffering was a test of faith. Neither could fully claim the truth, for the truth had been wrapped in wax and lead and hidden beneath the stones of St. George's Chapel. As I reflect on these final images, I see more than the grotesque details. They reveal a monarchy at a turning point, a realm poised to pass from personal tyranny to factional rule. A society still clinging to medieval rituals of embalming and procession, even as it stepped into the age of Reformation and humanism. Henry VIII's corpse, in all its corruption, was the bridge between those worlds, the last breath of an old order and the stinking herald of a fragile new one. By mid-February, the formal obsequies were completed. Trumpets sounded in Windsor, heralds proclaimed the virtues of the departed king, and the great slab of St. George's Chapel closed over him. But beneath that stone lay not the mighty conqueror of monasteries, nor the radiant prince of Hans Holbein's brush. Beneath it lay a man rotted from within, embalmed in haste, entombed in secrecy, and remembered by those few who dared whisper the truth as a sovereign undone by his own body. Thus ends Henry VIII's journey, from golden youth to tyrant, from reformer to relic, from the Lion of England to a leaking coffin on a cold February night.